The courtroom hummed with anticipation, the steady rustle of papers, the hushed murmurs from the gallery, the distant echo of a gavel striking in another chamber. It was a familiar symphony to Judge Margaret Caldwell. Sitting at the bench, she adjusted her glasses and scanned the docket. Just another day, just another case. Or so she thought. Next case, the state of Mississippi versus Daniel Carter, the bailiff announced. Margaret barely glanced up at first. She reached for the case file, flipping it open with practiced efficiency. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A pang of disappointment settled in her chest. Another name, another lost cause tangled in the system. Then she heard the chains. The clinking of shackles, a sound she had long since learned to ignore, suddenly cut through the room like a knife. And then she looked up. Her world tilted. The man standing before her, wrists and ankles bound in iron, wasn't a stranger. The sharp fluorescent lights cast hard shadows across his face, but the eyes, those deep, unshaken eyes, were unmistakable. Daniel Carter. Daniel. A rush of memories flooded in, threatening to pull her under. Late summer afternoons racing bicycles down dusty back roads. Whispers exchanged beneath the towering oak in her backyard. Promises made under the Mississippi stars, swearing to always have each other's backs. But the man before her was not the boy she once knew. His shoulders sagged, weighed down by time and hardship. His face, once full of boundless ambition, was lined with quiet resignation. He looked older than his 42 years, the kind of age that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with survival. Margaret's grip on her gavel faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. Daniel's eyes met hers. Recognition flickered. Shock, pain, something unspoken. Then, just as quickly, he looked away, his head bowing slightly, as if bracing for what was to come. The courtroom waited. Margaret forced herself to breathe, forced herself to find the voice she had trained so meticulously over the years. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone steadier than she felt, "you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" Silence stretched thin between them. Then Daniel spoke. His voice was rough, cracked at the edges, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Margaret's pulse hammered in her ears. This wasn't just any case. This was Daniel. And somehow she had to figure out how to separate the past from the present, before it was too late. The courtroom faded, its walls dissolving into something distant and unimportant. Margaret barely heard the prosecutor's voice, the murmur of the spectators, the rhythmic tapping of a reporter's pen against a notepad. She was no longer in that grand hall of justice. She was back in Hollow Creek, Mississippi, a world away from the polished mahogany of her bench. Back in a place where summer air smelled of honeysuckle and warm dirt, where the cicadas hummed a lullaby under a sky stretched endless and wide. And there, beside the creek that carved its way through the edge of town, was Daniel Carter. They had met by accident. She had wandered too far from home, curiosity tugging at her feet. Daniel had been fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She had watched from the tree line for a moment before stepping forward, offering to help. He had hesitated, studying her with quiet suspicion, the kind a black boy in the Deep South learned early, even at 9 years old. "You're not supposed to be here," he had said. "Neither are you," she had shot back. And that was how it began. Over time their friendship deepened, a rare and fragile thing in a town where lines were drawn not just in the dirt, but in blood and history. Hollow Creek didn't just separate people by wealth or opportunity, it separated them by color, by unspoken rules that no one questioned out loud but everyone understood. Margaret's house had a white picket fence, a manicured lawn, Sunday dresses and piano lessons. Daniel's home sat at the end of a dusty road, weathered wood and rusted screen doors, a place where the world never seemed to give much, no matter how hard a man worked for it. Their friendship was something that shouldn't have existed, and yet it did. They spent long afternoons racing bikes down abandoned roads, shared whispered dreams beneath the shade of an ancient oak. Daniel wanted out. Even then, he saw the world for what it was. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he had asked one night, lying on the grass beside her, their eyes fixed on the stars. "Really leaving? Going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" Margaret had laughed then, brushing off the idea. Leaving? Hollow Creek was all she had ever known. But Daniel wasn't joking. The weight of their differences loomed over them, a storm always brewing on the horizon. The whispers came first, the stares, the quiet warnings from people who thought they were being kind. And then one evening, it ended. She hadn't even seen him coming. Her father's voice was like a knife in the humid air. "Margaret, inside, now." She froze. Daniel froze. "Go on," he had murmured, voice steady, but his eyes had held something she couldn't quite name. Something final. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't. Her father forbade her from seeing him again, and then just weeks later, Daniel's family was gone, their house empty, as if they had never been there at all. Margaret buried herself in school, in ambition, in becoming someone who mattered. She had convinced herself that she had done what she had to do. But sitting in that courtroom now, watching Daniel in chains, she realized something else. She had left Hollow Creek. Daniel never got the chance. The past receded, swallowed by the harsh reality of the present. Margaret forced herself to focus as the prosecutor Nathan Briggs rose from his seat. His sharp blue suit was immaculate, his expression cool and calculated. He was the kind of man who didn't lose cases. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady, authoritative, "this case is simple. The evidence is clear." Margaret's gaze flickered to Daniel Carter. He sat rigid at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together, his face unreadable. But Margaret knew what wasn't being said. The way a black man accused of robbery and assault in Mississippi was already guilty in the eyes of some, long before the first witness took the stand. Briggs continued, stepping toward the jury. "On the night of June 14th, at approximately 10:23 p.m., a man entered Grady's Gas and Convenience on Highway 12. He argued with the clerk, pushed him to the ground, and proceeded to empty the register before fleeing the scene. The victim, Mr. Cliff Andrews, suffered minor injuries." Margaret listened intently as he painted the scene. A violent act, swift and deliberate, but she had heard enough cases to know that the truth was rarely that neat. "Mr. Carter was detained less than 3 blocks away," Briggs continued. "He was in possession of $326 in cash and—" he paused for effect. "He fit the description of the suspect." Margaret exhaled slowly. Fit the description. She had heard that phrase too many times before. The courtroom was silent as Rebecca Lane, Daniel's defense attorney, stood. Young, sharp-eyed, and relentless, she had built a reputation for challenging cases no one else wanted. "This case isn't as simple as Mr. Briggs would have you believe," she began, pacing the length of the courtroom, "because what he's not telling you is just as important as what he is." Margaret watched as she turned toward the jury. The only witness to this so-called robbery is a single-store clerk who admits he never saw the suspect's face clearly. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. "The surveillance footage," she continued, "grainy, poorly lit, unclear. It shows a man in a gray hoodie entering the store, but there's no way to definitively identify the person in that video as Mr. Carter." Margaret felt the first crack in the prosecution's case. Then Lane dropped the bombshell. And what's more, when Mr. Carter was arrested, he was not wearing a gray hoodie. In fact, no hoodie was found at all. So, I ask you, how do we know, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the police arrested the right man? Margaret glanced at Briggs. His jaw was tight, his fingers pressing against the table. He hadn't expected her to go this hard, this fast. But the jury? Margaret could see the uncertainty creeping in. For the first time, the case wasn't so clear after all. The weight of doubt hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud. Margaret could feel it, not just in the jury's shifting expressions, but in the rigid way Nathan Briggs sat, his hands clenched into fists. The case was no longer as airtight as he had hoped. Rebecca Lane wasn't done. She turned, her gaze landing on Officer Michael Tate, the arresting officer, who had just taken the witness stand. A seasoned cop, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. But there was a stiffness to him, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Lane approached with slow, deliberate steps. "Officer Tate," she began, her voice calm but pointed. "You were the first officer on the scene, correct?" "That's correct," Tate answered, his voice gruff. "You stated in your report that Mr. Carter was found 2.5 blocks away from Grady's Gas and Convenience. Walking alone?" "Yes." "And you detained him because he matched the description of the suspect?" "That's right." Lane tilted her head slightly. "Could you clarify what that description was?" Tate shifted in his seat. Black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing. Lane let the words hang in the air. Then she turned to the jury, arching a brow. "Dark clothing." She paused, then turned back to Tate. "But the suspect in the surveillance footage, the one committing the crime, was described as wearing a gray hoodie." Tate's jaw tightened. "That's correct." "So, just to be clear, when you arrested Mr. Carter, he was not wearing a gray hoodie?" A pause. "No," Tate admitted. "He wasn't." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Margaret caught a glimpse of Daniel, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Lane took a slow step closer. "Did you conduct a search of the surrounding area for this so-called hoodie?" Tate hesitated. "No, we didn't have time." Lane didn't blink. "You didn't have time, or you just assumed you had the right man?" Briggs immediately objected. "Argumentative?" "Sustained," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. Lane stepped back, but she had made her point. "Let's move on," she said. "Did Mr. Carter resist arrest?" Tate nodded. "Yes." He became agitated and refused to comply immediately. Lane's lips pressed into a thin line. Did he resist, Officer Tate, or did he protest his innocence? Tate hesitated again. He claimed he was innocent." Another ripple of whispers. Margaret saw the jury members exchanging uncertain glances. Lane delivered the final blow. "So, Officer Tate, let me get this straight. You arrested my client because he happened to be nearby, wearing different clothing than the suspect, with no physical evidence tying him to the crime, and when he protested his innocence, you considered that resisting arrest?" Tate's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing, and that silence spoke louder than words. The cracks in the prosecution's case had turned into gaping holes. The courtroom felt heavier than before, thick with tension, as Rebecca Lane rose from her chair. She turned to face Daniel Carter, who sat motionless beside her, his hands clasped tightly, his posture stiff. The weight of this moment was crushing, but he had made his decision. He would testify. "Mr. Carter," Lane began as he took the stand, the faint clink of his shackles filling the silence. "You understand that you are not required to testify, correct?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was low but steady. "And yet you still choose to speak?" A pause. Then, "Yes." Lane took a breath. "All right, Mr. Carter. Let's start with that night. Where were you at the time of the robbery?" Daniel lifted his gaze, looking toward the jury, then toward Judge Margaret Caldwell, whose expression remained unreadable. "I was walking home," he said simply. "I had been visiting a friend earlier that evening, and I was heading back to my place when the cops pulled up on me." Lane nodded. "Did you have any knowledge of the robbery that had just occurred?" "No." His voice was firm now. "I didn't even know anything had happened until they had me in cuffs." "You were found with $326 in cash. which the prosecution claims was stolen from Grady's Gas and Convenience. Can you explain that? Daniel exhaled slowly. That money was mine. I had just gotten paid that day. I worked. At Millie's auto shop. You can check with my boss. Lane turned to the jury. You had just received your paycheck? Yes. Was it in cash? Yes, ma'am. Millie pays some of us in cash if we ask for it. Lane nodded and let the words settle in the air. The jury was listening. She continued, her voice softer now. Mr. Carter, I have to ask, when the officers approached you, did they ask where you had been or give you a chance to explain yourself? Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. No, ma'am. They told me to put my hands up. One of them already had his hand on his gun. I knew better than to argue. A ripple of unease spread through the room. So you complied? Yes, but I told them I didn't do anything. They didn't care. They'd already made up their minds. Lane took a step closer. Mr. Carter, have you ever been arrested before? Daniel hesitated, his jaw tightening. Yeah. For what? Petty stuff. Loitering. A shoplifting charge when I was younger. I didn't even do it, but I took the fall for a friend. A couple of fines I couldn't afford to pay on time. Nothing violent. Lane turned back to the jury. Nothing violent, she repeated, emphasizing the words. So let me ask you, Mr. Carter, did you rob that store? Daniel sat up straighter. His voice, though quiet, carried across the room like thunder. No, ma'am, I didn't. Lane stepped back. No further questions, Your Honor. Nathan Briggs stood, buttoning his suit jacket, and approached with a practiced confidence. Mr. Carter, he said smoothly, you claim you were walking home that night. Can anyone verify that? Daniel's hands tightened on the armrest of the witness stand. No, my friend, I don't want to drag them into this. Briggs smirked slightly. Convenient, he mused, pacing in front of the jury. And you say the money in your pocket was yours. Do you have proof? Daniel's jaw clenched. Millie can vouch for me. Briggs nodded as if considering the answer, then turned abruptly. You admitted you've been arrested before. Isn't it possible that this was just another one of those times? Lane objected, badgering the witness. Sustained, Margaret said, her voice firmer than before. Briggs exhaled, then turned back to Daniel. No further questions, Your Honor. As Daniel stepped down from the stand, he dared a glance toward Margaret. For just a second, their eyes met, and she saw it. Not just his defiance, not just his exhaustion, but his plea for justice, for fairness, for someone to finally listen. The air inside the courtroom felt suffocating. The walls, the jury box, the gallery, it all seemed to close in as the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone inside. Judge Margaret Caldwell sat motionless at the bench, her hands clasped tightly together, her face unreadable. Has the jury reached a verdict? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. The jury foreperson, an older woman with silver hair and tired eyes, rose from her seat. In her hands, a small piece of paper trembled ever so slightly. She cleared her throat. We have, Your Honor. Margaret gave a small nod. Please proceed. The entire courtroom held its breath. In the case of the state of Mississippi versus Daniel Carter, the foreperson began, her voice barely above a whisper, we find the defendant. A pause. A silence so thick it could crush bones. Not guilty. For a brief frozen moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then, like an earthquake shaking loose, the room erupted in gasps, murmurs, even a few sharp exclamations of disbelief. The sound of reporters scribbling furiously on their notepads mixed with the rustling of bodies, shifting, turning, reacting to what had just happened. Margaret lifted her gavel. Bang! Order! She commanded, her voice firm. Across the courtroom, Daniel Carter sat perfectly still, as if his body hadn't quite caught up with what had just been said. His hands, still clasped together, tightened. His shoulders sagged, not in relief, but in sheer exhaustion. He was free, but he had never truly been free. Margaret inhaled deeply before addressing the courtroom. "The jury has spoken," she announced. "Mr. Carter, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." Another bang of the gavel. Margaret barely registered the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as people stood. The voices blurred together, a cacophony of reaction, some relieved, some angry, some simply in shock. Through it all, Daniel remained still. And then slowly, almost reluctantly, he rose to his feet. The shackles on his wrists and ankles were removed. The cold metal clattered to the floor, the sound strangely hollow. And yet Margaret knew those chains had left marks that no key could undo. She watched as Daniel turned toward the exit, walking away from the table that had held him captive for the past week, away from the courtroom that had decided his fate. For a moment she thought he might leave without looking back. But then he stopped, turned. Their eyes met. And for the first time since this trial began, Daniel spoke directly to her. "You knew," he said, his voice quiet. Not accusing, not forgiving, just knowing. Margaret's throat tightened. "You knew I didn't do it," he repeated. "Didn't you?" She didn't have an answer. Or maybe she had too many. The courtroom had emptied. The murmurs, the gasps, the weight of judgment, it had all faded into silence. The only ones left were Judge Margaret Caldwell and Daniel Carter. He stood near the exit, his hands, finally free of shackles, resting at his sides. The tension between them was thick, not with anger, but with something far heavier, unspoken words, years lost, and truths too painful to voice. Margaret rose from her seat, stepping down from the bench that had separated them. She had spent her entire career upholding the law, believing in its power to deliver justice, but today, for the first time, she questioned if justice had ever really been served at all. Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You knew, Margaret?" His voice wasn't bitter, just tired. Margaret met his gaze, searching for the right words. But what was there to say? That she had doubted the case from the beginning? That she had wanted to stop everything and demand answers? That she had spent every night of the trial haunted by the past? By him? "I couldn't say anything," she admitted. Her voice, steady in the courtroom, now felt small. "If I had spoken up, I would have been compromised. It could have jeopardized the case." Daniel let out a quiet laugh, not amused but resigned. "Compromised," he echoed. "You mean doing the right thing would have made things messy for you?" Margaret's breath caught. She had no defense. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I'd been someone else?" Daniel continued, taking a step forward. "If my skin had been lighter, if my record had been clean, if I'd had the kind of lawyer that rich folks pay for?" Margaret clenched her jaw. She wanted to say it wasn't about that the system worked the way it was meant to, but that would have been a lie, and Daniel deserved more than that. So she told the truth. "Yes," she admitted, "I wonder about that." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then he nodded, not in approval, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement. She saw it now, really saw it. "You got out, Margaret," he said, voice quieter now. "You got to be more than what this place tried to make you. But me?" He gestured at himself, at the invisible scars of a lifetime spent fighting battles he never chose. "I never had that chance." Her throat tightened. She had left Hollow Creek. He had been left behind. And now, standing here, free but not truly free, Daniel wasn't asking for an apology. He was asking if she would do something about it. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I can't change the past." "No," Daniel agreed, "but you can change what happens next." She nodded. And as he turned to leave, disappearing through the courthouse doors, Margaret made a vow, not just to herself, but to him. She couldn't fix what had already been broken, but she could fight to make sure it never happened again. Life has a way of leading us back to the choices we've made, the people we've left behind, and the truths we've tried to ignore. Judge Margaret Caldwell spent her career believing in the justice system, only to realize that justice isn't always fair, and fairness isn't always justice. Through Daniel Carter's trial, she came face to face with a reality many prefer to overlook, that sometimes the system fails the very people it claims to protect. For many, Daniel's story is all too familiar. Prejudice, assumptions, and past mistakes often outweigh truth in the eyes of society. But what this story teaches us is that acknowledging injustice is only the first step. What truly matters is what we do about it. Margaret couldn't undo the years Daniel lost, but she could fight to ensure others wouldn't suffer the same fate. As we grow older, we understand more than ever that life is not just about the past. It's about what we choose to do with the time we have left. We have a responsibility to recognize injustice, to speak up, and to leave behind a world better than the one we were born into. The story of Margaret Caldwell and Daniel Carter is a reminder that justice is more than a verdict. It's a commitment to truth, fairness, and change. Life gives us chances to right past wrongs, to stand for what is right, and to ensure no one is forgotten. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to share more powerful stories about justice, redemption, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.